Fat Joe has never been the type to hold his tongue. From the very beginning of his career, the Bronx heavyweight built his name on loyalty, respect, and a willingness to call out anyone who crossed him. That honesty made him one of the most respected voices in hip-hop, but it also created enemies. Over the years, Joe has found himself locked in some of rap's most unforgettable battles, trading blows with rivals in magazines, on wax, in back rooms, and sometimes even face-to-face. Now, after decades of silence on some of the ugliest moments of his journey, Fat Joe is pulling back the curtain and finally revealing the 6 artists he hated the most. Starting at number 5, we have 50 Cent. When people talk about Fat Joe's biggest enemies in hip-hop, one name always comes up before the rest: 50 Cent. Their feud wasn't just another back-and-forth exchange of insults. It became one of the defining rivalries of the 2000s. At the time, 50 Cent was more than just a rising rapper. He had already turned himself into a larger-than-life figure. After surviving a that nearly killed him, he came back with a story that made him untouchable in the eyes of fans. His album Get Rich or Die Trying was dominating the charts, and his aggressive attitude gave him an edge that felt unstoppable. But 50 wasn't content with just being on top. He thrived on conflict. His first big target was Ja Rule, and he spent years tearing Ja down with relentless diss tracks and humiliating moves that left Murder Incorporated in pieces. For 50 Cent, everything was personal. You were either standing with him or you were standing against him. No middle ground. Fat Joe learned that lesson the hard way. In 2004, Joe joined Jadakiss on Ja Rule's track New York, which was meant to be a gritty anthem celebrating their city. But because it was Ja Rule's song, and because it carried subliminal jabs at 50, Joe's appearance felt like he was siding with Ja in a war that was already vicious. To 50 Cent, that was betrayal. In his mind, if you tried to help an enemy he had already cornered, you had just volunteered to become his next target. And when 50 chose you as a target, he didn't play fair. In 2005, he dropped The Massacre, one of the biggest albums of that decade.
I'm looking if I see. I'm like,
so you knew it was good.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah. So it was supposed to work. If I wasn't,
it's a strategy.
Him sticking with his own story is petty.
No,
by the way, but
if I didn't say anything about that record, it would have worked.
And buried inside it was a song that would become a nuclear strike on his rivals: Piggy Bank. On the track, he mocked Joe directly, clowning his music sales and reducing his hit Lean Back to a weak imitation of 50's own success. The song wasn't enough though. The video that came with it turned Joe into a cartoonish, overweight boxer getting beaten senseless by 50. It was humiliating by design, and it worked. Fat Joe wasn't about to let it slide. He answered with My Fofo, a diss track where he tore into 50's credibility and even accused him of juicing up on steroids. The insults flew back and forth, but this wasn't just lyrical sparring. It started spilling into real life. The 2005 MTV Video Music Awards turned into one of the most infamous moments of their feud. When Fat Joe walked on stage, he took a jab at G-Unit by joking about all the heavy police presence in the building. The cameras caught 50 in the audience seething, and during a break, he stormed onto the stage, shouting curses and throwing insults across the room. The audience didn't know if it was staged or real, but both men made it clear later this was no act. The hatred between them lingered for years. Joe admitted in interviews that the beef cost him millions in endorsements and business opportunities, and he always said that if he and 50 ever ran into each other unexpectedly, a fight was guaranteed. This wasn't just for the cameras, it was deeply personal, and both men carried it like a badge of pride. But time has a strange way of softening even the hardest grudges. In 2012, tragedy forced them into the same room. Their longtime friend and respected music executive, Chris Lighty, passed away, and both showed up to pay their respects. Joe recalled seeing 50 on the opposite side of the funeral home but keeping his distance. A few weeks later, during rehearsals for a tribute performance at the BET Awards, fate made them cross paths. After they performed their songs, 50 walked up to Joe, extended his hand and said simply, "Peace for Chris Lighty." Chris Lighty wanted peace. Joe was shocked, but he shook his hand. Just like that, one of hip-hop's ugliest feuds came to an end, not through more diss tracks or staged reconciliations, but through honoring a man who had been important to them both. Since then, both have admitted they wasted years locked in that fight. 50 has openly said he went too far, while Joe has used their story as a warning to younger rappers about how dangerous these rivalries can get. Moving on to number 4, we have Jay-Z. If the clash with 50 Cent was explosive and loud, Fat Joe's rivalry with Jay-Z was the exact opposite. This wasn't about wild diss tracks or shouting matches on award show stages. It was colder, quieter, and more calculated, like two chess masters circling each other on opposite sides of New York. Joe was holding down the Bronx, while Jay had Brooklyn locked. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, both of them were aiming for the same thing, the undisputed crown of the city. The competition between them wasn't spoken of outright at first. They weren't throwing punches in the music, but everyone in the streets knew it existed. That rivalry eventually spilled into one of the unlikeliest arenas you could imagine, the legendary Rucker Park basketball court in Harlem. By the summer of 2003, the Rucker tournament had become more than just a street ball contest. It was where hip-hop reputations were made, and both Jay-Z and Fat Joe built their own superstar squads to battle it out. Joe pulled no punches when it came to stacking his Terror Squad team. He brought in real NBA firepower with names like Stephon Marbury and Kenyon Martin. Jay-Z, never one to be outdone, had his Rockefeller roster buzzing with rumors that he would unleash none other than a young LeBron James, fresh out of high school and already a household name. The championship game wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was shaping up to be a showdown for cultural dominance, a way of declaring who truly ran New York. The hype was unreal, but fate had other plans. On the very day the championship was set to go down, New York City was hit with a massive blackout that shut everything down. The lights went out across the city, and with them, the showdown everyone had been waiting for. When the game was rescheduled, Jay-Z's team never showed. Fat Joe's Terror Squad was awarded the win by forfeit, and just like that, Joe could say he beat Jay on one of the biggest stages New York had to offer. In his own words, years later, Joe admitted it wasn't just about basketball. To him, that was the real championship of New York. Even if it came with an asterisk, the bragging rights belonged to him. But as always, the competition made its way back to the music. Fat Joe let his feelings be known on his 2006 album, Me, Myself, I. On the track The Greatest Story Ever Told, he didn't hold back, making it clear that while Jay might have had the world's respect, he believed the streets were telling a different story. Jay, on the other hand, didn't go for direct shots. He was the king of subliminals, the kind of rapper who could make a line sting without ever saying your name. And many fans believe that during that period, some of those clever darts were aimed squarely at Joe. This Cold War dragged on for years, and it came at a cost. Fat Joe has been brutally honest about what it cost him, claiming in interviews that the tension with Jay-Z ended up draining over $100 million in potential opportunities. Brands and corporations weren't going to risk angering Jay by aligning themselves with Joe. He even lost out on a sneaker deal with Reebok because of it. What had started as an unspoken rivalry turned into something that had real consequences for his career and his bank account. Still, time has a way of changing things. Just like with his feud with 50 Cent, the loss of Chris Lighty in 2012 began melting some of the ice. But the true turning point came a few years later when music forced them back into each other's orbit. In 2016, Beyoncé dropped her groundbreaking album Lemonade, and Jay-Z wanted to use his streaming service Tidal as the exclusive home for it. He knew he needed radio support and the right voices to get it everywhere, and that meant calling someone who held serious sway. That someone was Fat Joe. By then, Joe and Remy Ma were back in the spotlight with their monster hit All the Way Up alongside French Montana and Inferred. Jay-Z didn't just support it, he personally jumped on the official remix, turning the song into one of the biggest moments of that year. For fans, it was shocking. Two men who had once kept their distance were suddenly on the same record, and not just tolerating each other, but celebrating together. Joe would later describe the phone call from Jay as a fairy tale moment. When Jay told him, "Let's do this for the culture," it wasn't just about a song. It was about finally putting an end to a rivalry that had hung over them for years. Cuban Link is another artist Fat Joe hated. If fighting with 50 Cent was about pride and going toe-to-toe with a heavyweight, and clashing with Jay-Z was about strategy and power, then the battle with Cuban Link was something far more personal. This wasn't just about rap or business deals, this was about family. Back in the late 1990s, Terror Squad was more than just a crew. It was a brotherhood. At the heart of it all was Christopher Big Pun Rios, the first Latino rapper to go platinum and one of the greatest lyricists hip-hop has ever seen. Fat Joe was his closest friend, and the man who helped put him on. But within that circle was another rising star, Felix Delgado, better known as Cuban Link. Cuban had talent, charisma, and with Pun guiding him, his future seemed bright. The three of them together gave Terror Squad its identity. But when Big Pun died suddenly in February of 2000, the glue that kept them bound disappeared overnight. The shock of Pun's death sent ripples through the entire culture. But for Terror Squad, it was devastating. Without Pun's presence, old insecurities and hidden resentments began to surface. Cuban Link has said countless times in interviews that this was the moment when everything changed. According to him, Joe turned his focus inward. pushing his own career and putting energy into Remy Ma, who was becoming the next big name under his wing. Cuban felt abandoned. He believed he had earned his place in the spotlight, yet the opportunities started drying up. That bitterness only grew when issues about Big Pun's estate came to light. Pun's widow, Liza Rios, would go on to publicly accuse Fat Joe of not handling royalties properly and failing to provide for the family the way Pun would have wanted. Cuban stood firmly by her side, arguing that Joe wasn't living up to his responsibility as Pun's brother-in-arms. In his eyes, Joe wasn't just ignoring Pun's legacy, he was erasing it by cutting off those Pun had mentored. As Cuban's frustration turned into open hostility, the music industry itself became another battlefield. He has always maintained that Joe used his power behind the scenes to block him from signing record deals, leaving him frozen out of the success he believed was his destiny. Whether true or not, Cuban's career never reached the heights it once promised, and he has always pointed the finger at Joe. Everything exploded in the summer of 2001. Angie Martinez was celebrating her album release at Jimmy's Bronx Cafe, and the place was packed with industry figures and street heavyweights. What was supposed to be a night of celebration descended into chaos. According to Cuban Link, he was confronted by a man from Joe's circle known as Skeletor. A shouting match quickly turned violent, and in the middle of the melee, Cuban's face was badly damaged. The scar was permanent, and so was the resentment. Cuban has never let go of the belief that Joe set him up that night, that the attack was no coincidence but a message sent loud and clear. He would later describe it in one interview with Raw Emotion, saying he had been ambushed and left with a reminder he would carry for the rest of his life. Joe has always brushed off these accusations, rarely diving into the details. He paints Cuban as a bitter former member with a grudge, but for Cuban, the wound is as real as the scar on his face. He poured all of his anger into the diss track Letter to Joe, where he accused his former brother of betrayal and laid bare everything he felt was stolen from him. More than 20 years later, that bitterness hasn't gone away. Cuban still speaks about it, whether on social media, podcasts, or interviews, each time reminding the world of what he says really happened. Whenever Fat Joe takes the stage and speaks about loyalty, unity, or his love for Big Pun, Cuban fires back, calling him a hypocrite and challenging his version of history. The fight with Cuban Link remains one of the ugliest scars on Fat Joe's legacy. Unlike his battles with outsiders like 50 Cent or Jay-Z, this wasn't about competing for the crown of New York or defending his spot on the charts. This was about trust, loyalty, and the collapse of a family that had once been inseparable. Coming in at number 2 is Masta Ace. The chaos surrounding Terror Squad wasn't the first time Fat Joe found himself locked in a heated feud. Long before the public wars of the 2000s, his reputation as someone who would fight tooth and nail for respect was already carved into New York hip-hop. To trace it back, you have to rewind to the mid-90s, when the East Coast and West Coast rivalry had the culture on edge. At that time, choosing sides was almost mandatory. In the middle of that climate, a young Fat Joe clashed with a Brooklyn veteran who was already a lyrical legend in his own right, Masta Ace. The spark wasn't even a record, but something printed in the pages of The Source, the magazine that shaped rap conversations in the 90s. In a 1995 interview, Fat Joe expressed frustration that some East Coast rappers weren't standing up enough for their own coast. He felt New York artists were letting the West Coast dominate without showing proper loyalty to their home turf. And right there, he singled out Masta Ace. To Joe, Ace was embracing the West Coast a little too much at a time when New York needed unity more than ever. For Masta Ace, that was not just unfair but personal. He had built a reputation as one of the sharpest lyricists of his generation, a storyteller whose respect reached far beyond borough line. In his eyes, Joe's comments painted him as disloyal, when really he was making music that connected with everyone, no matter where they came from. Instead of brushing it off, Ace chose the battlefield he knew best, the studio. Soon after, he dropped Top 10 List, a diss track that took aim directly at Joe. It wasn't a throwaway shot, it was clever, cutting, and designed to remind everyone that Ace wasn't someone you could casually call out. The record circulated quickly, with fans picking apart every line. Ace went straight for Joe, mocking his music while defending his own decision to create without being boxed in by regional politics. In the eyes of many, it was a brilliant response that put Joe on the defensive. And while most rap beefs in that era stayed on wax, this one carried an extra edge. Whispers began circulating that the two men had actually crossed paths not long after. The story that made its way through the streets was that at a charity event in New York, Joe confronted Ace face to face, and things nearly turned physical. Both men have addressed this in later interviews, with Ace admitting the tension was real but never confirming every detail. while Joe himself admitted he was quick to react in those years whenever he felt slighted. What makes this feud important isn't just the diss track or the rumors of a confrontation. It's what it revealed about Joe at that stage of his career. He wasn't yet the polished hitmaker with chart-topping singles, but he was already carrying the Bronx on his back with pride. Calling out someone as respected as Masta Ace showed he wasn't afraid of reputation. He wasn't afraid of hierarchies, and he definitely wasn't afraid of conflict. It was proof that his loyalty to New York was absolute, and if he thought you weren't doing enough to represent, he would put your name out there no matter the cost. At the top of our list is Uncle Luke. By the time the dust of those older battles had settled, Fat Joe was no longer the same fiery kid from the Bronx who swung at every slight. Age, experience, and the scars of countless conflicts had changed him into something bigger, a figure of wisdom and hip-hop. And that growth was put to the test in a clash that could have spiraled into yet another bitter feud, this time with none other than Luther Campbell, better known as Uncle Luke, the godfather of Miami rap. The spark came in 2022 when Fat Joe sat down on ESPN's Jalen Jacoby. In his usual larger-than-life storytelling style, he began reflecting on his years in Miami, a city that had become his second home. While giving props to its scene, he mentioned that he had played a big role in helping artists like Pitbull and Trick Daddy land their first big breaks. He even recalled introducing them to Ted Lucas, the head of Slip N Slide Records, the powerhouse label that would later become synonymous with Miami rap. To Joe, it was a way of saying he had always supported the city that embraced him. But to someone like Uncle Luke, who had lived, fought, and built the Miami hip-hop movement from the ground up, those comments sounded like a rewriting of history. Luke had already cemented his legacy long before Slip N Slide was even formed. As the leader of 2 Live Crew, he had not only pushed Miami sound into the mainstream, but also gone toe-to-toe with the U.S. government in his famous obscenity battles, defending freedom of speech for all of hip-hop. He was the man who had discovered Trick Daddy and helped shape the careers of countless Miami artists. So when Fat Joe's comments started circulating, Luke wasn't about to stay quiet. He hopped on Instagram, posted a message directly to Joe, and said, "I love you, my brother, but I have to check you on this one." His tone wasn't hostile, but firm. He laid out the true history of how Trick Daddy was signed, how Ted Lucas played his role, and how Joe had nothing to do with it. He closed with something rare in hip-hop, an invitation to talk man-to-man instead of letting it fester in public. And this is where the story turned. Years ago, the younger Fat Joe might have fired back with anger or doubled down on his version of events, but instead, he chose the path of respect. He immediately responded, not with defensiveness, but with humility. He jumped on an Instagram Live with Uncle Luke, where the two men hashed it out in front of thousands of fans watching in real time. The conversation was not tense or hostile. Joe let Luke speak his truth and acknowledged that his own comments had been clumsy. He explained that he never intended to erase anyone's role, and that his only goal was to highlight how connected he felt to Miami's culture. He gave Luke his flowers right then and there, calling him the true pioneer of Miami hip-hop and thanking him for all he had done, not just for the city, but for the entire genre. Luke, in turn, accepted the apology and showed equal respect back, making it clear that there was no bad blood.